If you're looking for the Ontology and Oncology talk, you're in the right place. If you're not looking for that, you should probably leave. Just kidding, you can hang out. But it's my privilege to introduce Sean Mullane today. He's going to be giving this talk. Sean is currently working as a data scientist in the UVA health system while completing a master's degree in data science at the UVA Data Science Institute, where he's researching the applications of machine learning to protein structure prediction. That's pretty impressive. He has lived in Charlottesville since graduating from UVA as an undergraduate. Current areas of work include deep learning, natural language processing, and precision medicine. So I think I'm just going to hand it over. I think we're good to go.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks. All right, so the title of my talk is Ontology and Oncology, NLP for Precision Medicine. So hope you're all here for that talk. What is precision medicine? Start here. So how many of you are physicians? All right, as I figured. So we're talking about oncology here and precision medicine, and the two of them together in particular, because precision medicine is particularly well suited to oncology. It's also used in some other emerging fields in medicine, but particularly in oncology. So oncology, just a refresher, is cancer science and cancer treatment. And precision medicine is the focused application of knowledge and precise targeting of drugs and treatments to specific medical conditions. Cancer is uniquely suited to this because it is really not just one disease or even a handful of diseases. As we've been learning over the past however many decades, cancer is really just a multitude of different diseases. It's just about as varied as it can be. The closer people look, the more they discover that what they thought was one cancer is actually several or many. Since cancer is a disease of mutation, not only does it cause a great diversity in the types of cancers, but each cancer can respond differently to treatments. So a cancer study that may find, say, 50% effectiveness of a drug on what they thought was one type of cancer might actually be targeting more than one cancer. It might work well for one type, and perhaps unbeknownst to the researchers at that time, it works really poorly for another type, and maybe later they'll discover, this is not actually the same exact disease, and they can track down the molecular targets and other properties that determine whether a particular drug worked for a particular variant. One of the difficulties in cancer treatment is that a person can often have multiple mutations, multiple variants of cancer. Something that's commonly seen in treatment is that an initial course of treatment goes well, and tumors seem to be shrinking, the patient seems to be going into remission, and then maybe only some number of weeks or months later, a different mutation related to the original cancer comes back up, rears its head, and proves resistant to the treatment and maybe kills the patient. That's something that happens pretty frequently in cancer treatment. And historically, cancer treatment has actually been kind of largely a case of kill the cancer without quite killing the patient. Since the cancer is part of the patient, it's part of a person, just mutations, but essentially the same tissue. Things that are effective against cancer treatments, so radiation therapy and chemotherapy, are often quite harmful, quite toxic. And the trick is just to find ones that are better absorbed by the cancer cells, or just to try to narrowly target them physically in the cases like radiation therapy or surgery. But it's often difficult to discriminate between the cancer cells and healthy patient cells, and so these treatments, in addition to often being not entirely effective, are often harmful to the patient as well. And sometimes it's impossible to kill the cancer without killing the patient. So for all these reasons, precision medicine is seen with quite a bit of promise in the oncology community. The ability to find a specific treatment that might be less toxic to the patient and more toxic to the cancer, essentially, and to the exact cancers that the patient has. It's quite a promising topic. So again, the idea of precision medicine is the precise targeting of these treatments to these cancers. Now, determining which treatment is effective against which cancer is a very well-funded and broad and ongoing field of study. And we're not focusing on figuring that out in this talk. We're focusing more on the application once that's been determined by some medical research or other. So just to give you some ideas of milestones in cancer understanding, in 1937, the National Cancer Institute was founded. Since then, you can see just some of the highlights, some of the milestones over time. It's in the last several decades, really, that the genetic components of cancer have begun to be understood. And generally, this has been a story of finding that what they thought was maybe one thing, maybe just breast cancer. Time was they thought, okay, breast cancer, and then they discovered, aha, well, there's this variant and that variant. The BRCA1, BRCA2 genes were discovered, and that was a big step forward in treating cancer. And over time, especially in the last 10 or 20 years, quite a few variants and specific molecular targets, and sometimes drugs to hit those molecular targets have been discovered. Some of the more recent advances involve immunology, so actually taking a patient's own immune system and helping it to target the cancer cells. And there's quite a bit of promise in this field, most of which has yet to be realized, to be frank. There have been some successes in the treatment of cancer using precision medicine targeting techniques, but really most of that effectiveness is yet to be realized. So still quite a bit of promise, but it's going to be quite a bit of an uphill battle to get there. One of the difficulties is just the amount of information that a practitioner has to sort through to try to find, okay, what is the particular treatment we want for this particular patient? So the number of publications in PubMed that include the word cancer have gone up at pretty much an exponential rate over the last several decades. For one researcher to read all of these has long since been completely impractical. Now within a subfield, of course, there are fewer, and maybe a researcher can focus on narrower and narrower subfields. But essentially, this presents an information retrieval problem. How can we find for a given patient what is the most effective treatment likely to be for that particular patient? And the more we know about which treatments are effective for which genetic variants and which cancer variants, the more specific we want to get with our searches. So in 2018, UVA participated in the TREC scientific abstracts task for the precision medicine track. How many of you were at TREC this past year? Oh, okay. So TREC is a NIST conference, the text retrieval conference. And in the last 2 years, they held a precision medicine track for the retrieval of potentially useful treatments and potentially useful clinical trials for a given patient. We participated in the scientific abstracts task, not the clinical trials task. So the way this works is they created a number of synthetic patients. So this is no real patient data was involved in this. To alleviate concerns about privileged health information. But they had a number of oncologists from MD Anderson create these synthetic patients that represent commonly seen combinations of diseases and genes that they're particularly interested in being able to focus on. So for example, we have a patient with thyroid cancer, genetic variants, BRAF gene, RET, basic demographics, 63-year-old female. And the question is, for this particular patient, can we find the scientific publications that are most relevant to their treatment or potentially most relevant to their treatment and return that. So to do this, we kept it reasonably simple. We want a vector space-based model. We want TF-IDF-based frequency weighting, and the standard tools in the text search space. I'm not particularly an information retrieval expert, so I'm sure there are better tools out there than what we chose to use, but this is what we had available to us and wanted to see what we could do with it. So to get this, we used Elasticsearch, fairly standard, straightforward. We already had an instance set up at UVA. We want to mostly reuse the tools that we had available to us to see what we could do with it. So problem solved, right? Well, not really. We got something. You can get something decent just by throwing all this text into Elasticsearch. We took all the scientific abstracts through the publications, about 3 million that passed a rough filter. And threw them into Elasticsearch, and yeah, we could get something decent out of that, but not quite as good as we want. We want to see how good can we do. So our solution to that was to try to make use of the existing medical ontologies that are out there, and to use text term embedding, and to treat these ontologies as a graph, and to do a concept-based query expansion. So the medical ontologies that we're making use of are compiled by the National Library of Medicine. In total, they form what's called the UMLS Metathesaurus, the Unified Medical Language System, and the Semantic Network, so the Metathesaurus and Semantic Network. And between these, they aggregate about 200 separate ontologies, including some of the major ones like SNOMED-CT and RxNorm, NCI ontology, the ICD codes, ICD-9, ICD-10, which are used in diagnosis billing. If you've ever gotten a hospital bill, you'll see these diagnosis codes. And these ontologies have medical concepts that are actually pretty wide-ranging, anything from a physical object to an organism, to biological function, anatomical structure, demographic information even, kind of higher-level ideas and concepts. One of the nice things about these ontologies is that they distill a great deal of medical knowledge into not only the set of concepts, but also the relations between them. I think there are about 1,800 distinct relation types in the ontologies that we used. And they can get quite detailed. So between two concepts, you might say this concept has a gene involved in the expression of this other concept, which is a disease. So with this very expressive graph, we were hoping to be able to extract some useful information out of this and to improve our query system. So the question is, how did we make use of this ontology? So we did two things, essentially. The first one was text term embedding. So we started with all of our raw text that we fed into Elasticsearch. And we started by using Apache CTake. So this is an open source natural language processing system. It was developed at Boston Children's College, Mayo Clinic, Harvard, I believe some others. And this is based on the IBM UEMA framework, unstructured information management architecture, and it's a kind of modular system that allows us to annotate these documents with medical concepts and other parts of speech, entity recognition. It's got quite a few potential features out there. In this project, we made only fairly basic use of it in annotating with UMLS concepts. So we declined to use any of the more advanced features like temporal relations or other features like that, just to kind of keep it relatively simple. So what we get out of this is the words and phrases in these documents are identified as one or more of these discrete identified concepts, or CUI is a concept unique identifier in these ontologies. And so we take this document and essentially transform it into a set of concept codes. So we start with our PubMed article abstracts and our queries, and we annotate these both. So our article embedding, we end up getting something like this. And our query terms, we got a structured query where our diagnosis has a concept code, our gene has a concept code, our demographic has a concept code. I think this would be something like middle-aged male, just a fairly high-level concept code, but still more than nothing. So the benefit of the concept embedding is one, is just dimensionality reduction. So we have multiple variants of a term that may or may not actually be related in terms of, say, the like Levenshtein distance. But we have, nevertheless, they all get annotated to the same concept. And so this is kind of intelligent dimensionality reduction that we get more or less free. That it does, if we were trying to do something more advanced involving parts of speech and syntactic parsing, that might present a problem. But in this case, since we're just using a vector space model, that doesn't really cause us any problems. So just using this additional concept embedding and adding that as another field in Elasticsearch, we take our performance on this check task from here to here in terms of the precision of the top 10 documents of the first page of search, essentially, and from here to here in terms of the NDCG score. Just a quick aside on how these scores were created. So all the check participants returned each set of documents that were judged by those teams to be relevant to the treatment of a patient. And for each of the documents that were returned, the Oregon Health Science University provided a set of oncologists to review those scientific abstracts and score them on relevance. So we wound up having about 16,000 documents scored for relevance. And based on those scorings, we get these results. So interesting thing is the text only and the concepts only actually both did quite a bit worse than text and concepts combined. So the concept embedding is lossy in comparison to what the total information content we can get here. So both of them combined gives us quite a bit of better improvement in precision. And it does give us an improvement as well on NDCG, but less so in comparison to the track median. Which is represented by this red line here and here. So that's our first result, and we'd like to do better. So the next thing we tried was a query expansion. So query expansion is rewriting the query. We might start with something like this, and we might want something like this. There might be articles and abstracts that are for articles written about the topic that we're interested in, but they might not use the exact terms that we're interested in the abstract. If you're sat and poured through scientific papers, you find the abstracts are just all over the place, and some of them are very easy to parse, and some of them just can make your head spin. And the set of terminology that gets used might be quite different between researchers, especially if they're coming to a field from different angles, from different backgrounds. So we want to see, can we use query expansion to improve our performance as well? We've really improved precision with our first task and recall somewhat, but we want to see if we can improve recall further. So this graph here is just a very small subset of the UMLS graphs that we created based on the ontologies. So what we did is we fed these into Network X to represent them as a graph. And what we get is a set of concepts like melanoma, melanocyte, Homo sapiens, kind of, you can see it behind me, and the relationships between them. And what we see in this graph is some of these concepts are very particular and might have very few relations. Now granted, this is very pruned. Each of these concepts has quite a few more relations than is shown here. But still, we can see that some have very few relationships, like malignant melanoma of skin of the back. And some of them have quite a few, like Homo sapiens is extremely general. And so the shape of this presents a challenge in that if we want to use a graph-based concept expansion, we want to make sure we're expanding to the right concepts. We don't want all of our concepts to expand to Homo sapiens, even if they're directly connected there, because it'll completely wash out our precision. So we have a benefit here in that this is a very expressive ontology. So we have each of these concepts is connected by edges that have types associated with them. And what you're not really seeing here is that actually nodes in this graph can have multiple connections between them. So this node and this node could actually have multiple edges of different types. And that's actually quite relevant to our approach. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to weight these edges and these paths by the degree of relatedness between them. So if we can define relatedness between this and this one, this one and this one, this one and this one, this one and this one, then we can say, okay, what is the node that's nearby that is most closely related to our given node? So we'd like to have a numerical value that represents the relatedness. The question is how to do that. And so we made use of an exclusivity-based relatedness metric. And the way this works is we have nodes x and y in our graph and edges with types tau in between them. So to calculate the exclusivity between two neighboring nodes, we look at the number of connections of a given type between node x and all of its neighbors, immediate neighbors, and do the same thing with its neighboring node, node y. And the exclusivity of a given edge is 1 over the sum of those counts minus 1. So that gives us the exclusivity of a single edge between two nodes. Then we can, for a path P, we can calculate the weight of that whole path. And that's just 1 over the sum of 1 over the exclusivity between the nodes in that path. So if we have a hop of length 4, for example, we calculate the exclusivity between n0 and n1, n1 and n2, n1 and n3. And that gives us the weight of a single path. Now, two nodes can have quite a few paths between them. And for our project, we pruned those paths to, I believe, his length no greater than 4, just to keep the numbers tractable. But nevertheless, you can have quite a few paths between two nodes, each with their own weight. Finally, to calculate the relatedness, we sum over all of these paths between the two nodes, sum the weights, and we penalize the length of the path. So if we have a path of length 4 that has a total weight of 2, we really want to penalize that compared to a path of length 1 with weight 2. So we use a parameter alpha that's less than 1. For our project, we chose alpha equals 0.5. And summing that up gives us our exclusivity-based relationship. Our exclusivity-based relatedness measure. Finally, to do our query expansion, for each of these concepts, we just selected the top however many nodes. In general, we chose this constant c to be between 0.1 and 0.2, which gave us about 5 to 10 related concepts for each of the main original concepts in the query. So in doing so, this gives us what we're looking for. So Homo sapiens here has quite a few connections of many types between itself and many other nodes. So we look at the type organism has gene, for example. And this is very much not an exclusive thing. So if we are over at this gene and we want to expand out from it, we want to weight paths that go through Homo sapiens very low. And that's what we see here. We get 0.0. Whereas if we're at this gene and we do want to expand to melanoma, and we do see that there is a larger weight associated with that. And one note about the setup of our graph for this, there are some requirements for this algorithm to work. In particular, the relationships need to be symmetric. So That's actually not the case generally in UMLS. So between node X and node Y, you might have a relationship of one type. Between Y and X, you might have a relationship of a different type. It could be as easy as this is a that, and that inverse is a this. And those are easy to symmetricize. Just if we see a pair, we get rid of them both and we replace them with a single is a path. But there are plenty of places where node X had a relationship with node Y had a relationship with node X. These are directed paths, directed relationships, but they're not directly inverses of each other. So to handle that, we pruned paths that we could not easily symmetricize. So I think we wound up getting rid of about a third of all of the paths here, and there's possibly better ways to handle this. We could just take every single directed path and call it undirected, see what happens. We haven't tried that. It might work better, might work worse, but it's an area for future work. But that is the main requirement for this algorithm to work. The other, of course, is that you have multiple paths of different types between nodes. If you only have a single type or no types at all to your edges, then you can't use this algorithm. So the result of applying the query expansion is we get about the same precision as without. So this is without the expanded queries, and this is with, depending on what level of boosting we give to those. In Elasticsearch and our NDCG, our performance is here. So we get a slight improvement when we to NDCG when we boost the expanded queries, a slight harm to precision there. So we get a bit of a trade-off here, but we do see an improved recall with the query expansion method. So just in sum, precision medicine is still a very open field, and tools that help physicians find these the best treatment for patient is still very much a work in progress. Track 2019 has this path, this track that's going on again. If anyone is interested in trying that out, and I guess I'll take questions.
So I'm very interested to know if you do any type of decay factor when you expand to the concepts pairs.
So in this algorithm, we do a decay factor based on the length of the paths connecting nodes when we calculate the exclusivity. So we so alpha is less than 1 here. So the longer the path, the lower these the component of the weight will be rated.
And then this weight is what you're using as part of your search execution?
Yes, so that is what we use to determine our query expansion terms. So our query expansion terms for node Y, so if node Y, for example, is melanoma, and that's our search term, then the terms that we add to the query as our query expansion are the other nodes, any other node in the graph that is greater than C. So it'll essentially be the closest neighbors in terms of relatedness to Y. We did not use the relatedness in the actual calculation of distance for the query, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, yes. I actually work on something similar and do selective hypernym expansion based upon the concept type. So, for example, a product or a substance, Zoloft, my content may not actually have that drug. So I would expand to something like antidepressants. But I would apply a decay as part of the search. So I'm just curious, if when you go back to the results that you had, I'm actually looking more for precision. It sounds like you're actually looking for a blend of more recall and precision, so your goals are slightly different. But I'm surprised that you didn't see a higher lift by doing the concept expansions.
Yeah, it was interesting. And one thing I could say about this is that when we did our data pre-processing, we wound up not catching the articles from 2015, 2014, which is actually quite a few of them. So in comparing our result to the Trek median, we're a bit penalized by that. in the NDCG. That doesn't affect our precision really. So it's hard to say how we would have done compared to the check median if we hadn't had that pre-processing issue. But nevertheless, in the direct comparison here, it is interesting that we don't see much of an increase. It's hard to say why that is. It could be that a different formulation of this would do better. Maybe if we did the query expansion using the full set of relationships, for example, I don't think that would make that much of a difference. But if we incorporated that into the actual search relevance calculation itself, that might give us a better result.
Yeah, I thought this was very interesting because I'm trying to crack this nut of how I can leverage that knowledge graph better,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how we execute. So this was very interesting to see a different approach because we're kind of more on a basic of what the concept is about,
Mm-hmm.
some definition of the concept.
Yep.
Whether it's a person or it's
Mm-hmm.
disease, a symptom.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, obviously, that was his concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps that UMLS is so large and so well filled in. One thing I'll say is that if you're interested in this particular algorithm, we got it from this. There's, I believe, a conference paper here from Hopeless et al. So that's in the bottom of this slide. If anyone wants to look it up and read through the paper.
Can you speak a little bit more? It sounded like you said that with your symmetric approach,
Mm-hmm.
you were pruning a third of the potential arms.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking very differently that if I have a DAG, it's only one way, and if I'm a ISA and I hit this node, then I get a relationship, but if I'm on this one, I don't get it, it seems like I would want to have ISA on both sides and create the symmetry. So can you explain more of
Sure. Yeah.
how you did that and what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah. So in the graph, let's go to this one.
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is about the symmetricization of the, if that's how you pronounce it, of the graph. So we had, for starters, this and how we do the symmetricization. That was the question. So just to reiterate, the UMLS graph has these relationships that are all directed relationships that are between two concepts. Now, so for example, you might say X is a Y, or Y is a X. But what it doesn't have is you don't see X is a Y and Y is a X. You'll see X is a Y, and maybe you'll see Y inverse is a X. So is a and inverse is a are two different types that essentially mean the same thing. But there are other types that don't have that kind of easy. They don't have that easy invertibility. So you might say. So some other easy ones are organism has gene. They've got another type that as gene is had by organism. It's another easily inverted type. But some of them don't have an inverted type. So some of them you'll see. I don't remember off the top of my head which examples I could point to, but you might have X has a certain relationship with Y, and that's it. There's no relationship back from Y to X. And when you look at the types, it's difficult to come up with a plausible relationship type from the set that you could say, okay, well, this must be the inverse of this one. So the way we handled that is we looked at all of the relationship types and the pairs we saw in the graph, and we said, okay, well, if this one has a plausible inverse, like ISA and inverse ISA, then we get rid of both of those directed edges and we replace them with one edge that is, we just call it ISA. We just choose one of the two, kind of arbitrarily. And we say, okay, now we've got this one type, this one edge, rather than two edges, which basically mean the same thing. That's the key, is we want one edge for one type, not two edges for what are essentially the same type. So the issue there is that only works for the ones that could be easily inverted. The ones that could not easily be inverted, we chose to prune those. Now the other approach that stands out to me is we could choose to say that we just won't prune those, and even if there's not a straightforward inverse, we would just choose one of those kind of at random, and we'd keep it. The issue is that some of these you might have. The question would be how to name them at that point. particular approach when there's invertibility, it doesn't matter which of the two you choose, ISA or inverse ISA. But you have to do some disambiguation because if you have, say, 3 types, none of which is an inverse to each other, and all of which show up in the graph, but some of them have relationships. So you might have an X connecting to Y and Y connecting to X. You still need to prune that. You still want, if it's essentially acting as an inverse in one case, you want to prune it and replace it with a single edge, so you're not double counting. So it's a little nitpicky. It's a little once you start looking into the details, it becomes a little less obvious how you'd handle that. But I think there are ways we could handle that, so we're not having to prune that. We just haven't explored those yet.
So is the edge you create undirected then, so ISA works both ways, so you can navigate from either side?
Yeah. Once we prune it, then we can say it's undirected. Hey, great.
So you're getting rid of the direction when you say that bang bang, it's just so either when you start it, you can still get to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
the prunement, you only kept one side, and I was like,
Yeah, so essentially once we prune and replace double edges with single edges, then we just declare it undirected, and there we are. Yeah. Yep.
In terms of retrieval, would that not sometimes cause problems where, let's say you have stomach carcinoma is a subset of carcinoma?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's searching for carcinoma, ignoring the fact that carcinoma is actually in the phrase stomach carcinoma,
Mm-hmm.
but you could reliably expand it because this is a subtype. But if you were to go the other direction, where someone searches for stomach carcinoma, expanding that to always include carcinoma might create noise in the results.
Yeah, so that's an advantage of the exclusivity-based measure, in that carcinoma is going to have a lower exclusivity value with all of its neighbors than stomach carcinoma, just by virtue of being a more general term. So the more general terms, like especially when you get to Homo sapiens, is just going to have a very low exclusivity relatedness to everything because it's just such a general term. And so this penalizes any term that's general, which is why it's helpful in this case.
So, what is the downstream reason why you couldn't use directed edges? Like you said, you had to turn all your edges into undirected edges,
Mm-hmm.
and that was because I guess the model wouldn't work.
Yeah, so the way this algorithm was developed, that was a requirement for the calculation to work. I think it could probably be modified to handle directed graphs, but with the time we had available to us to work on this, we chose to the easier path was to modify the graph to fit the algorithm than to try to modify the algorithm to fit the graph.
I was just curious, especially because like the first step looks like it's directional. If step 1 looks directional, and then maybe it gets lost.
So the reason, the thing here is that this edge from X to its neighbors has to be of the same type as the edge from the neighbors to Y. If this were directional, then it would kind of mess up this calculation here. Mm-hmm.
So when you are calculating a relatedness, let's say you are looking for melanoma treatment,
Mm-hmm.
there will be in one word in a paragraph in the whole document, right? The person who is reading it can make sense. How you are comparing the distance? You take the distance into consideration?
So I'm not sure I got the question. Can you?
So if you are looking for the melanoma treatment, right?
Yeah.
It could occur in a one sentence, like one paragraph,
Mhm.
melanoma treatment, and one chapter actually,
Mhm.
whole document, not in a whole book. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you are calculating the weight at the time of relevance, do you take that distance between the words into
No, we use a fairly standard, just the vector space model built into Elasticsearch. So that's just TF-IDF on the vector space model. It's just a statistical method that doesn't take into account, for example, the distance between words in the text. So it's a fairly kind of old-fashioned, simple model yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide where you are expanding melanoma into Fourier rewrite?
This one?
The second slide where you said melanoma
Oh.
means 3 terms, right?
This one.
Okay, when you get this query, and at the time of issuing the query to the Elasticsearch,
Mhm.
right? do you issue a query with these three terms?
We do.
Okay, let's say the melanoma has at least 10 to 20 synonyms or 30 synonyms.
Mhm.
Aren't you falling into the synonym expansion problem?
So that's handled by the embedding. So if melanoma has synonyms, they all get tagged to the same concept. And when we're, I guess I wasn't clear about this, when we're expanding this out, we're not using the actual text term. We're not using the word, we're actually using the concept code that's associated with the word. And so that takes care of the synonym problem. Yep.
So, just so I can follow, is your problem that post-expansion, most of your results are ill-ranked, and so maybe you're matching on so many documents because of the expansion that the really relevant stuff falls down in rank? Or is it that you're actually eliminating because the expansion isn't expanding enough or in the wrong direction? And so those documents, it's not even relevance that you're just filtering out.
Right, that's a good question. And we really didn't dive in enough to be able to determine the answer to that. But it's a good question because it's probably one or the other primarily, and I don't know which one. Yeah. Oh, in the back.
So your graph, is it stored in a like a RDF privilege concept, or it's sitting on? You mentioned it's converted into the UMLs. Trying to understand it. It's a UMLs. How different it from RDF triplets or things like that?
So the way we created this is we downloaded the UMLS files and instantiated them into a database. So we have a database table that has columns for a concept, the mapping from one to another, and then the other concept. And we fed those the data from that table into into NetworkX, so a library in Python that works with graphs, and then wrote some functions that allow us to parse that network in the ways that we need to get these calculations. So when we're running a query, we're kind of running that query against the NetworkX graph, if that answers your question.
It's not stored in a graph database.
Not a graph database per se, no. It's just kind of the Python library that handles the graphs, but it's not really a database system. Oh, yeah.
Did you try to compare this approach to a simple baseline like using user interactions to learn those synonyms or from the behavior of the user on the site?
We did not. So this is completely unsupervised, what we did. We don't have any baseline otherwise. One thing we would like to look at in the future is we do have quite a bit of data on real patients who have been diagnosed with cancer and have gotten treatments, and then either they've had whatever outcome they've had. And in the future, we could look at integrating that data into this query system to essentially say, okay, we've got a patient, they've got X, Y, and Z conditions and genes. If we have the genetic information, which for most we don't, but for many I think we do. And we could look at the actual outcomes and treatments given and try to use that as a supervised model. But as that would be kind of a more involved research study, go through the IRB and all that. So to kind of keep things simple for this attempt, we just chose to make it a completely unsupervised method.
Do you have any plans of using word relationships like direct knowledge?
That's a good question. I think it'd be interesting to try, certainly. And it might be useful to, I think we'd probably want to retrain, rather than using one of the pre-existing embeddings, we'd want to probably try to retrain a new one on medical text. So, for example, if we could just parse or extract the text from all of PubMed and then train an embedding on that and see how it does. I think that'd be a really interesting comparison to what we've done here, but we haven't done that yet.
With your annotation engine, or whatever it is that is applying the UMLS concepts from the text,
Mhm.
Do you know if that has the option of doing sentence or paragraph scoped annotation so you can draw some of these concepts closer together?
It does. It does, yeah. We're only really using kind of scratching the surface of CTAKes in this project. We've done some other work where we're parsing radiology notes and finding mentions of deep vein thrombosis in those notes, and that involves a bit more of a kind of fine work of finding related concepts in syntactically related concepts. So if we have a diagnosis finding and an anatomical mention, and they're connected to each other, then we can say, okay, this is a thrombus in the lower iliac vein or something. So it has the capability to do that, and we're using that in production. But we didn't use that we just kind of kept it simple for this one. Yep. Yep.
I think you mentioned that one of the options would be to put everything as an undirected graph, which I think you could try and set somewhere. Do you think that you'll get a heat on the recall as you make everything as an undirected graph?
Well, so we did make this everything an undirected graph for this task, and the question was more about what approach. Sorry.
Because it's going to get further expanded, more nodes going to get created because no pruning going to happen as you.
Right. So the other approach to making this an undirected graph would have a wider graph, wider expansion, and that could I think would, if anything, give us a benefit to recall. I don't know if it would hurt precision at all, but it would be fairly straightforward for us to try. So I'd like to give that a try and see how it does. But I'd hope that it would improve recall.
Aside from doing query expansion, have you tried applying this to find similar research, clustering research together to understand how things are related beyond like just using it at query time?
That's a good question. No, we haven't looked at clustering, but I think that'd be interesting. Another thing, actually, I could bring up that I think would be interesting is that we really only use the abstracts of articles for this, and there's quite a bit more information in those articles than just the abstracts. So parsing those could also be useful, and especially for clustering. I think it could be potentially an improvement in performance, but we haven't done either of those yet. All right. Well, thank you very much.